Studium to Studio with your local lay Dominicans, we'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message, representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter, and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Matthew Mayer.
And today we're going to be discussing, it sounds a little lofty or a theological topic, but I'm going to be learning a lot, I know, from you, Matthew. But and it has to do with atonement theology. And I think the statement you made earlier, Matthew, is a good way to introduce everybody to this idea. The incarnation is the greatest act of charity by God, or is considered the greatest act of charity by God. And we are in the middle of the Christmas octave as you're hearing this, so it's a good time to consider the incarnation, right?
It would be understanding that the nativity is supposed to be charity. It's supposed to be God as love presents the incarnation as the greatest act of love. And so and theology on atonement actually affects the way the nativity is presented. And it would be important to actually go through the history of theology atonement, their differences, and which one is the church's official position and why.
Can you give a sort of a general understanding of what atonement theology is? Just a simple...
Atonement theology would be a little bit like, let's see, Adam and Eve sin against God, and now there's a rupture between God and man from original sin, and now there must be atonement to that as a way to satisfy the justice that's of the sin committed between God and man. And so Jesus would be that atonement to sin. And so that would be a quick example of atonement. It's just there's a lot of theories that came up, and a lot of them being developments of other ones. And so the first one I would like to bring up is the one by the patristics. The early church fathers talked about the ransom theory of atonement, which was basically Jesus was a ransom for sin. But the thing they never really discussed was, who was he a ransom to? There will be some would say he's been a ransom to God, while others would say he's a ransom to the devil. Although the problem with being a ransom to the devil is to submit God to Satan, which would contradict divine justice. And so, as in accordance with divine justice, it would be Jesus ransoming himself to the Father.
So when you said that, it made me think of Narnia, the scene where it seems like justice for Aslan's death was for the evil, almost. Am I wrong in that, or would you say that's not?
I was thinking about that earlier, honestly, because I was looking through Wikipedia and it was talking about C.S. Lewis. But the thing is that it was supposed, from what I remember from the movie at least, Aslan was murdered by the White Witch.
Right.
But in Catholic theology, it was an offering to God. Okay, I'll be honest with you. I don't know if C.S. Lewis did a good job portraying that well.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna throw that to the side, maybe. But I think he should try better next time.
Okay. Because I buy that, because I don't think it's lining up with the idea. I mean, it seems like there seems to be a problem with that if you're looking theologically at it, with how he presented it.
I mean, it's supposed to be, yes, it was supposed to be, I guess you can consider that Satan was trying to conquer over Jesus on the cross, but eventually Jesus outdid Satan.
Right.
And so,
Okay.
I guess you can say, with Aslan he was offering himself to save one of the children.
Right.
Technically he's trying. I think like even Tolkien had problems with Lewis.
Right.
That it was a little too obvious, but at the same time it looked like he was trying a little too hard on trying to make an illusion.
Okay. Well, that's good. No, so this is ransom theology, which is what kind of we're trying to give examples of. So go back to that now that I sidetracked us with Narnia a little bit. So
eventually it was developed into a recapitulation theory of atonement by St. Irenaeus, which doesn't contradict ransom theory, but it just develops it to saying Jesus became man he became man to undo what Adam did. And so he's basically the new Adam trying to redo what Adam did wrong, except he's going to avoid the sin this time and offer himself to God.
Okay. And so what was that called?
Recapitulation theory of atonement. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
No, recapitulation. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
And so, from the recapitulation theory of atonement, there came Saint Anselm, who developed the satisfaction theory of atonement, which he used an allegory of feudal lord, where the tenants, I believe, all sin against the feudal lord, making him lose his honor, and the only way to restore his honor is for there to be a satisfying atonement to actually restore honor. And so here it would be God being offended by the sins of man. Jesus comes as the perfect man to offer himself to God as satisfying of divine, as satisfaction of divine justice. It's an offering of himself up to God on the behalf of man for his sins. And so that's basically basic Christian understanding. St. Thomas Aquinas developed that one as well, but he still maintains satisfaction theory, but explained it better by saying Jesus was not punished on a personal level by the sense that he sinned, but rather it's his offering of himself for the sins of others. And so he took on you could say he took on the punishment of sin, but it wasn't a punishment it wasn't a deserving punishment. It was an act of charity to present. I could say it was an act of charity to take on the punishment deserving of other people. So this is basically him not needing to actually for the punishment of others, because he didn't earn it, but he did it anyway through charity. And so St. Thomas Aquinas had to develop between the two ideas. He wasn't punished because he deserved it, but he was punished because he chose it upon himself.
So there's been some discussion, in theological fields on, did Jesus take on the guilt? Did he become guilty? Did he take on that guilt, or did he just take on the consequences of guilt, which would be death? Because of course, him as an innocent person, took on the consequences of death. But there were some, I don't know if some Protestants believe this, but did you find anything in your research or thought on whether Christ actually took on guilt itself?
That actually comes later with the Protestant Reformation, but before that, there was actually a man named French philosopher named Peter Abelard, who taught that moral influence theory of atonement, which actually rejects the satisfaction theory of atonement, and taught that how'd it go? It taught that Jesus died as a moral influence to everyone. There was no need for divine justice. Jesus was there to just show everyone what it means to be a good person. So divine justice was not necessary, or satisfaction for divine justice was not necessary, and that eventually would lead to more. I guess you would say a more liberal view on God, based on the sense of not needing to satisfy any retribution. It's basically Jesus already took care of that for him, just showed you how to be a good person.
I mean, which he did. It is an example of love, right?
It
to
is.
lay down your life, but there's more to it, right?
It is, but
that
the
was
thing is,
oversimplification, maybe?
I guess you could say that, because it only limits Jesus to being an example, and that's it.
Right. Okay, that's what.
And so eventually after that comes what I was talking about, the Protestant Reformation, the penal theory of atonement, where they take a more forensic view on St. Anselm's satisfaction theory of atonement, where it started off with Martin Luther, who thought about divine wrath from God, and someone needs to satisfy the wrath of God. But then comes John Calvin, who actually develops it even further to say Jesus is basically the whipping boy of God, who takes on the guilt of man's sins, and so he is therefore deserving of eternal punishment. So we give Jesus eternal punishment for the sins of man, but he's only here to redeem the limited elect. I mean, there are the elect, but at the same time, it enforces a more authoritarian view on God, saying that Jesus only redeemed the elect. In Catholic theology, he redeems both the elect and unelect, but that unelect will not be saved. They given the opportunity of salvation, but they are not going to choose it anyway. But I guess you could say the Calvinist theory, which is more basically penal theory to its logical end, is basically there's no opportunity for salvation for the unelect because they're already predestined to damnation. And the penal theory of atonement presents Jesus, goes against the satisfaction theory developed by St. Thomas Aquinas, where it says Jesus took on the punishment of sin that he didn't deserve. Penal theory presents Jesus as in the case as deserving of it, even though he didn't actually do any personal sins of his own. And so it would because it shows God as more wrathful for divine justice, it presents a more authoritarian view of God. And so that's why in more Calvinistic like churches you're going to find more authoritarianism applied to their doctrines, because they're going to present a more rigid view on social, I guess you could say social influence, because how religion affects society. And you could say Jesus, and so when it comes to the nativity, here is Jesus the whipping boy. It's actually more despair. The nativity is a sense of despair. Someone to come to only suffer hellfire. Although he would technically come back from the dead and go up to heaven, that problem actually shows the penal theory being self-contradicting right there. And so it would be God going to hell while still remaining in heaven. And technically, well, you could say technically Jesus did that with the harrowing of hell, but this is God being damned hell. And so this is basically a self-contradiction, and it presents the nativity more as a tragedy than as a sign of hope.
Wow, which we wouldn't want to do, especially right now. So.
That's right. During this Christmas octave. So there were some theologians that I guess had different perspectives. Even I think within Catholic circles, is that one side or some said that, okay, so from the beginning of time, God knew, Jesus knew that he was going to come to this earth, and knew from all eternity that this was going to happen. And it was not a reaction to sin. So to me, it's splitting hairs. But then there's some theologians that said, yes, Christ came specifically as a reaction to sin, to open up the gates of heaven so people can enter into the kingdom. Does that really matter? Is it splitting hairs? What are your thoughts on that?
The problem is that these atonement theories actually puts more human emotions on the divine, where we talk about divine wrath, it would actually present more God as being passionately wrathful, in the sense that we feel passionately wrathful when we want to get back, once we want to get back at someone for doing something wrong to us. But it equates divinity with humanity. It emotionalizes God, and the thing about God is he's not subject to emotion. He goes, I guess you could say he goes above it, but he doesn't have the same passions as man, or passions at all in the concupiscence sense. And so you can say, yeah, it splits hairs. You have to understand God in a negative theology to understand how these atonement theories are supposed to work and not work. And I guess you can say another one would be coming after the Protestant Reformation was Socinianism from Lelio Sozzini and Fausto Sozzini, after they made the moral example theory of atonement. It was literally the same thing as the moral influence theory of atonement, but it's more applied to actions rather than Jesus showing what it means to be a good person. He wants everyone to learn this is how you're supposed to live as a good person. The only problem is it's more of a subjective paradigm right here. It just presents Jesus more as, I came to die as an example. I didn't need to satisfy anyone. There's no divine justice in the moral influence theory of atonement. But then again, it also comes from the objective paradigm as well, the governmental theory of atonement by Jacobus Arminius. It also came from John Wesley as well, and part of Arminianism, which you'll find a lot of influence in the Methodist Church, which presents Jesus as he did come as a substitute for sin, but now divine justice has been canceled because of that. So there's no more need for divine justice. Jesus already satisfied that. And so I guess you can say it in a way reflects satisfaction theory, but the problem is that it presents mankind no longer. It presents, how would I say, Jesus died. He no longer cancels out sin, and so it doesn't undermine divine. They say it doesn't undermine divine justice. he already satisfied God, but at the same time, there's no, I guess you could say, need anymore for divine justice. It has to do a lot with, I guess, a more, again, this is one of those more liberal views of God, where where he presents as merciful but without need for complete satisfaction. It presents the more like Arminianism has a lot of influence on voluntarism. It has a lot of the will and emotions depicting what must be true about God. It's a little confusing because, and that's one of the problems. It's confusing because a lot of emotions vary across people, and so as one of the governmental views, it has a very more lax position of God. That's all I can really say much about it. It's really not very satisfying on divine justice, and those are the main theories of atonement. And so what makes the satisfaction theory of atonement as developed by St. Thomas Aquinas different was that all the other theories has Jesus as like an influence, not a sense of satisfying divine justice, and because of that, it would present the nativity as just another event, not really that important. But the penal substitution one, the one developed by Martin Luther and especially John Calvin, presents Jesus as a whipping boy, no hope. He's basically, and it contributes to authoritarianism, presents the nativity as a gloom and doom event for him especially, or at least for him really. But it also brings no hope for anyone who hasn't been redeemed. But the Catholic position, as developed by Saint Anselm and Saint Thomas Aquinas, teaches that Jesus offered himself. He wasn't deserving of it like a Calvinist would teach, but it was also an essential necessity for divine satisfaction. And because this divine satisfaction, this justice came from charity, it presents the true nature of justice as one united with charity. But more especially, it presents, I should have said this way, charity, mercy, the perfection of justice. And this is what the satisfaction theory shows, is Jesus needing to satisfy God, but doing it without really needing to do it. He was essential for the satisfaction of God, but he didn't need to do it, but instead he decided to offer himself for it because he loved mankind. And so the nativity from that satisfaction theory of atonement shows the true nature of Jesus as the ransom of man for charity. So in here, it presents the nativity as charity, and in this case, an authentic hope for the redemption of mankind.
You're listening to Christ Our King Catholic Radio. We are your Third Order Dominicans, your lay Dominicans. Here's with our show, Studium to Studio, every Thursday at 4 p.m. We bring the fruits of our contemplation to you every Thursday, and we're able to do that thanks to Stein Lumber with locations throughout all of Acadiana. And so today we're talking about atonement theology, and getting into the theological weeds, as we say here. And so Matthew, you mentioned obviously what St. Thomas says. One of the probably most famous Dominican, next to St. Dominic. But you mentioned what St. Thomas talks about with regard to satisfaction, reparation, in terms of atonement theology, and which I think is very clear in church teaching. Now, there are some, Protestants that will say, let's look back into the Old Testament, and sometimes the Jews demanded sacrifice, sometimes they didn't. There were examples of sacrifice, but not human sacrifice per se, from the Jewish tradition. So, some are saying, well, this sacrifice did not have to take place because it would be contrary to what the Jews believed in the Old Testament. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the sacrifice for the Jews was more of a sign of what was to come, and I would say Jesus, and I would say what makes Jesus the sacrificial lamb was obviously being the substitution for the sins of man, but at the same time, what made him different from merely just any other ordinary lamb, what made him the Lamb of God, was the fact that he actually chose to get himself sacrificed. An allusion to Abraham and Isaac, where I remember hearing this from Father Zilli once, where No, not Father Sibley. It was actually someone he had teach that class a few years ago for a credo night. She was talking about that Abraham was actually really old, and Isaac, although portrayed as a kid, he was most likely in his 30s because of how it's still considered kid back in ancient perspective. And because Abraham would have been old, Isaac would have actually overpowered him when it came to the sacrifice. But the fact that he had himself bound shows that Isaac actually allowed himself to be sacrificed. So he actually just let Abraham do his will. And so it would actually portray a better understanding of Jesus. What made him different from any other lamb was the fact that this was one where he really offered himself without having to. He could have just left. He didn't have to die. But this was the only way divine justice would have been satisfied, and yet he didn't need to do it. But he did it anyway. He did it because he cared. And so when you see, and if you see the satisfaction theory, Atonement showing that Jesus just offering himself without needing to, shows that this is not a punishment of deserving sin. This is Jesus getting punished on the sins of others, and God, knowing this, Jesus is offering himself not of deserving penalty, but of, I guess you could say, merciful penalty. This is Jesus. Jesus, basically, that's why he's not the whipping boy of John Calvin. He's basically the satisfying Lamb of God. But the satisfaction theory of atonement is basically God satisfied by seeing the perfect act of love from his son. That's the issue that's going on right here. Mm-hmm. The thing is, the other theology, the Calvinist theology, focuses too much on the divine wrath of God, and that would be the problem with the other Arminian theology as well. Because they have too much of a focus on saying no, God's more merciful than that. It emotionalizes God. The other atonement theologies puts too much emotion in God, but the satisfaction theory of atonement focuses less on how does God feel about sin, but more on how much love is being offered by Jesus as a satisfaction for the sin of others. This is the satisfaction theory of atonement emphasizes mercy, and it shows the true nature of mercy as self-giving offering of oneself to God without obligation. Shows the true nature of love, and it shows the nativity as basically Jesus offering himself to the Father in the form of a babe and coming to grow up into man and to die, all as an act of charity.
Well, and it's interesting that we talk about this today, especially during this week of Christmas Octave, because you have these two, some might say, opposing events taking place. You have the birth of Jesus. You have the incarnation taking place, and then on the other hand, during this octave, we also commemorate the martyrs that really sacrificed themselves for the church and what the church stood for. So it's very interesting. We're talking about the love and the mercy and the charity. We see that from both God becoming man and also the martyrs offering themselves up in the name of the church.
And I guess you could say that's like one of the big important things when it comes to atonement theology, because the martyrs, if they're not the ones deserving of penal substitution on Calvinist theology, that would only be Jesus, who was now considered the worst sinner of all, and somehow and would end up letting the guilty go free and the innocent punished. And martyrs getting killed would be a moral influence, but it wouldn't also really matter because it's basically there's no sense of divine justice here, no perfection of it. And I guess you could say is Jesus being just another example. There's no unity with the sacramentality here. But with the Catholic position on the satisfaction atonement, it shows the martyrs not only just being good examples, but they're also showing them united with divinity and knowing what it means to be united with basically divine love. It's basically this is here the true development of true charity and the unification of charity as well. It is, I guess you could say, martyrdom in the Catholic sense is the participation on the cross. This is one of the hard things about Catholic theology, is that to know it best, you actually have to carry the cross with you. You have to. I know experience doesn't really teach you everything in theology, but it does help when it comes to accepting the sufferings given to you, accepting to carry the cross, and it has you reflect more on what is love united with this sacrifice, and it gets to show martyrdom, the true nature of martyrdom, the true meaning of it being a unification with God on the cross. And so you would say the other theology atonements don't provide that. There's no sense of sacramentality, no sense of mysticism in it. There's no sense of, I guess you could say, satisfaction even for man, because we have an existential desire for infiniteness, and only God is that satisfaction of infiniteness. And so it would be not only just satisfaction of God, I guess you could say it also be satisfaction for man by being united with God and knowing what it means to be mutual there.
So that brings me probably to, you were mentioning martyrdom, and since even though we're recording this on the Feast of St. Stephen, I can't help but note that after the nativity of our Lord, the next day we celebrate a martyr, a great martyr, St. Stephen. In the Office of Readings, the second reading for the Feast of St. Stephen has, I think, a great example of what we're trying to say. And it's talking about Jesus coming as king in his majesty, and yet as a gift of love. And it says, he brought his soldiers a great gift. That's us, the church militant. He brought his soldiers a great gift that not only enriched them, but also made them unconquerable in battle. For it was the gift of love, which was to bring men to share in his divinity. And then he goes on to show in the incident of St. Stephen's martyrdom, it says, and this is again the sermon by St. Fulgentius of Rusp, a bishop. He says, and so the love that brought Christ from heaven to earth raised Stephen from earth to heaven, shone first in the king, it later shone forth in his soldier. Love was Stephen's weapon by which he gained every battle, and so won the crown signified by his name. His love of God kept him from yielding to the ferocious mob. His love for his neighbor made him pray for those who were stoning him. Now remember, Paul was amongst those. And so it goes on to say, now at last, Paul rejoices with St. Stephen. With St. Stephen, he delights in the glory of Christ. With St. Stephen, he exults, and with Stephen, he reigns. So Stephen went first, slain by the stones thrown by Paul, but Paul followed after, helped by the prayer of St. Stephen. This surely is the true life, my brothers, a life in which Paul feels no shame because of Stephen's death, and Stephen delights in Paul's companionship, for love fills them both with joy. I mean, I think that's just, it shows sort of the whole circle of love and the gift of self, and the way that we can participate as saints in the atonement. We can participate in this because when we understand our aspect of atonement theology, that our part in it is what I want to share with other people, which is when we know that God is love and we can live love, that we're participating in that gift.
Yes, I would say that'd be the great case. And also, something I noticed also is, like I mentioned earlier, it was how atonement theology can also affect sociologically. Like I was mentioning how the Calvinist one can be more authoritarian, and while you could see a lot of Calvinist churches and areas tend to be a lot more, I guess you could say, conservative in a lot of issues, and a lot of the more lax understanding of God found in Armenian theology, mostly in Methodist churches. You'll find reasons why they tend to be a little more, I guess you could say, liberal on certain issues, and so. And it has an effect on, because how religion affects sociology, our perspective on God can also affect how the society can work as well, based on our understanding of goodness, because God is good. And so it would also, and so I guess you could say the Catholic theology would be the perfection of love and mercy, which all can be found in the incarnation of Christ in the midst of a manger.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's a great way to end. So remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past.